History teaches us that the collapse of nations is usually loud. Empires often fall amid the thunder of artillery, the clash of armies, and the visible violence of conquest. Cities burn, flags are torn down, and borders are redrawn through bloodshed. Yet not all empires meet their end in this dramatic fashion. Some are destroyed quietly, not by soldiers, but by numbers written in ledgers. Some are conquered not by invasion, but by obligation. In the 19th century, the greatest power of the Middle East did not fall because its armies were defeated on the battlefield alone. It fell because it lost control of its finances. This is the story of how the Ottoman Empire was dismantled without being formally conquered. It is the story of how debt became a weapon and interest became a noose. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been one of the most feared and respected powers on earth. Its armies had once stood at the gates of Vienna. Its fleets had dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Its sultans ruled lands that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa, commanding the most strategic crossroads in the world. By the mid-19th century, the empire still looked immense on a map. It stretched across the Balkans, through Anatolia, down into the Levant, across Arabia, and into North Africa. Millions of subjects lived under the authority of the Sultan in Istanbul, who ruled from a city that had once been known as Constantinople, the crown jewel of empires. To outside observers, the Ottoman state still appeared powerful. European diplomats spoke cautiously about Ottoman territory. Maps continued to color vast regions under Ottoman rule. Ceremonies, uniforms, and court rituals preserved the image of imperial strength. But appearances were deceiving. Beneath the surface of grandeur, the empire was suffering from a deep and worsening illness. Economically, the Ottoman system was falling far behind the rapidly changing world around it. While Europe was transforming itself through industrialization, the Ottoman economy remained rooted in an older age. Britain and France were experiencing the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines powered factories. Railways stitched together entire nations. Mechanized production flooded markets with cheap goods. Capital accumulated rapidly, and financial systems grew sophisticated. In contrast, the Ottoman Empire remained largely agrarian. Most of its population lived in rural villages, relying on traditional farming methods that had not significantly changed in centuries. Craftsmen produced goods by hand, unable to compete with the volume or price of European factories. Ottoman markets were increasingly flooded with imported European goods, undermining local production and draining silver and gold from the empire. The state itself struggled to extract revenue efficiently. The Ottoman tax system was outdated and deeply corrupt. Taxes were often collected by local intermediaries who kept large portions for themselves before forwarding the remainder to the central treasury. By the time funds reached Istanbul, much of the potential revenue had already vanished. This chronic inefficiency left the imperial treasury perpetually short of cash. Military expenses, administrative costs, and court expenditures consistently exceeded income. For generations, the Ottoman state had relied on methods that belonged to an earlier era to manage financial shortfalls. When money was scarce, the government debased its currency, reducing the precious metal content of coins. At other times, it confiscated the wealth of powerful officials who had fallen out of favor. These methods had worked in a pre-industrial world where economies were less interconnected and credit markets were underdeveloped. But by the 19th century, such practices no longer solved the underlying problem. Debased currency caused inflation and public distrust. Confiscations destabilized governance and discouraged investment. The empire needed a new solution. At the same time, external pressures were increasing. To the north, the Russian Empire posed an existential threat. Russia sought warm water ports and greater influence in the Black Sea and the Balkans. Repeated wars with Russia strained Ottoman finances and exposed military weaknesses. To survive, the empire needed to modernize its armed forces. That meant purchasing modern weapons, training professional armies, and maintaining naval power. It also meant investing in infrastructure such as roads, ports, and telegraph lines to support military and administrative control. All of this required capital, and the Ottoman state simply did not have enough of it. Despite this growing need, the sultans were deeply reluctant to borrow money from Western Europe. There were cultural and religious objections to usury, as well as political fears about dependency. Borrowing from Christian powers carried the risk of foreign interference in internal affairs. For decades, the empire resisted this path, even as financial pressures mounted. That resistance collapsed in 1853. When Russia invaded Ottoman territory, the conflict that followed became known as the Crimean War. This was not a small regional clash. It was a massive international conflict involving some of the most powerful states of the era. Britain and France, alarmed by Russian expansion and determined to preserve the balance of power, allied themselves with the Ottomans. They sent troops, ships, and military advisors. But alongside their armies came something far more consequential: financiers. War is expensive, and the Crimean War was no exception. The Ottoman treasury hemorrhaged money at an unsustainable rate. Soldiers had to be paid, weapons manufactured, fortifications repaired, and supply lines maintained. Gold reserves dwindled rapidly. Sultan Abdülmecid I faced a crisis that threatened the very survival of the empire. His advisors concluded that there was no alternative. To continue fighting, the empire had to abandon its long-standing taboo and borrow money from European banks. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with a consortium of British and French financiers. The loan was presented as an act of alliance, a gesture of support between partners fighting a common enemy. In reality, it marked a turning point that would reshape the empire's fate. The terms of the loan were harsh. The bonds were issued at a discount, meaning the empire received significantly less cash than the nominal value of the debt. For every £100 owed, the treasury received only 80. Yet interest had to be paid on the full amount. This arrangement imposed an effective interest rate far higher than it appeared on paper. The bankers justified these terms by citing risk. They knew the Ottoman Empire's finances were fragile, and they demanded compensation. What the Ottoman leadership failed to fully grasp was that this structure created a permanent imbalance. From the very beginning, the empire owed more than it had received. Servicing the debt would require future borrowing unless revenues increased dramatically, which they did not. At first, the loans seemed miraculous. Funds arrived in Istanbul. The army was paid. Supplies were purchased. The immediate crisis was resolved. When the war ended in 1856, and Russia was forced to accept defeat, the Sultan felt vindicated. He had preserved the empire. He had discovered a new source of power. With a signature on a document in London or Paris, he could summon wealth that would otherwise take years to collect in taxes. But this apparent solution carried a hidden cost. Borrowing created dependency. The Ottoman elite, having tasted the convenience of foreign credit, found it difficult to stop. Instead of using loans to build productive capacity, they increasingly used them to maintain appearances. European capitals dazzled Ottoman officials. Gaslit streets, grand theaters, and monumental architecture symbolized modernity and prestige. Istanbul, by comparison, seemed old-fashioned and provincial. The desire to project strength and civilization became irresistible. This longing for recognition drove decisions that would prove disastrous. Rather than investing borrowed funds in industry, education, or agricultural reform, the empire spent lavishly on symbols of imperial grandeur. The most striking example was the construction of the Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdülmecid I decided that the ancient Topkapi Palace no longer reflected the empire's status. He wanted a residence that could rival the palaces of Europe, a visible declaration that the Ottomans remained a great power. The Dolmabahce Palace rose along the shores of the Bosphorus as a monument to excess. It was adorned with enormous quantities of gold leaf. Its halls glittered with crystal chandeliers, marble imported from Italy, and carpets woven from silk. The palace was breathtaking, but it was also ruinously expensive. Its cost amounted to a staggering portion of the empire's annual revenue. Every stone, every decoration, was paid for with borrowed money. As the palace took shape, the deeper reality of the empire grew more grim. In Anatolia, peasants struggled to survive on marginal land, using outdated tools and techniques. Rural poverty deepened, even as wealth flowed outward to European creditors. To finance ongoing expenses, the Ottoman government returned repeatedly to foreign banks, each time accepting new loans under similarly unfavorable terms. By the late 1850s, a dangerous pattern had emerged. New loans were used not to generate growth, but to cover existing obligations. Debt was no longer a temporary measure. It had become structural. The empire was beginning to rely on borrowing simply to function. What had started as a wartime necessity was evolving into a permanent trap. The seeds of collapse had been planted. The empire still stood. Its flag still flew. Its ceremonies continued. But beneath the surface, the foundations were weakening. The Ottoman state was learning a lesson that history would repeat many times. When a nation loses control of its finances, it begins to lose control of its destiny. The Ottoman Empire's newfound access to foreign credit brought with it an intoxicating sense of power. The sultans, their advisors, and the elite could now summon gold seemingly out of thin air. A signature on a bond, a handshake with a European banker, a few hours in a London office. These were enough to pay armies, fund palaces, and launch extravagant projects. It felt like magic. It felt like a way to leap centuries ahead of their technological and economic rivals. Yet, this very magic was a gilded trap. Sultan Abdulmajid I and his court soon discovered that borrowing was seductive. Once the first loans were secured, the treasury faced mounting pressures to spend, and spending became a symbol of prestige rather than necessity. The Ottoman elite, already acutely aware of their empire's image on the European stage, became obsessed with demonstrating wealth, sophistication, and power. Borrowed money flowed into luxury, not productivity. Palaces rose, gardens bloomed, and ceremonial uniforms glimmered, while the countryside remained underdeveloped and impoverished. The contrast between Istanbul's opulence and Anatolia's poverty became increasingly stark. The Dolmabahce Palace was the pinnacle of this opulent culture. Every detail was designed to impress foreign dignitaries and project power. Enormous chandeliers reflected sunlight through crystal prisms. Walls were lined with imported Italian marble, and gold leaf covered the doors, ceilings, and ornate staircases. The palace included an enormous ceremonial hall capable of hosting thousands of guests, adorned with silks, paintings, and imported treasures. Yet while the palace dazzled, it also symbolized the empire's financial recklessness. Every coin spent came from loans that the empire would struggle to repay for decades. The cost of the palace and other projects far exceeded the state's capacity to pay. To cover these extravagant expenditures, the empire returned to London and Paris, repeatedly taking on new loans. Each successive loan worsened the situation. Terms remained predatory, requiring interest payments on amounts larger than the cash actually received. Ottoman debt was no longer a simple liability. It had become a self-perpetuating trap. The more the empire borrowed, the more it owed, and the deeper it sank into financial dependency. By the late 1850s and into the 1860s, the structure of Ottoman borrowing began to resemble a classic Ponzi scheme. Debt that had initially been intended to fund immediate wartime needs was now being rolled over to pay interest on previous obligations. Borrowing to service debt is a dangerous game under any circumstances, but in the Ottoman case, it was compounded by a failing tax system. The empire's revenues were insufficient to cover both its obligations and its domestic expenditures. Armies went unpaid, infrastructure projects stalled, and the government's credibility weakened. To maintain some semblance of liquidity, the Ottoman state turned to local financiers. These were mostly Greek and Armenian bankers based in Istanbul's Galata district, and they became intermediaries in the empire's financial machinery. When the treasury ran dry between foreign loans, the Grand Vizier would negotiate short-term credits with the Galata bankers at extremely high interest rates, often 18 to 20%. These transactions provided immediate cash, but increased the empire's vulnerability. Every transaction added weight to the already heavy financial burden, creating a cycle of dependency and desperation. The sultans themselves continued to indulge in symbols of power, further straining the state's finances. Sultan Abdulaziz, who came to power in 1861, inherited the debt problem, but also pursued his own vision of imperial grandeur. He was deeply impressed by European military power and naval technology. Determined that the Ottomans should not be outmatched, he commissioned a massive fleet of ironclad warships from British shipyards. He purchased the latest European cannons, armor, and machinery. On paper, the Ottoman Navy became the third largest in the world. In practice, it was a fleet without fuel, without maintenance, and without crews capable of sustaining prolonged operations. These ironclads became literal floating monuments to debt, representing an empire that had spent beyond its means. The 1870s brought new crises that exposed the empire's fragility. In 1873, a financial panic erupted in Vienna and spread across Europe. Known as the Long Depression, this global economic downturn caused capital to dry up. Banks that had previously lent to the Ottomans suddenly refused to extend new credit. The music stopped. Just as liquidity disappeared from the financial markets, nature delivered its own blow. Catastrophic droughts struck Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. Crops failed, livestock perished, and peasants, the primary taxpayers, faced starvation. Villages emptied, fields lay barren, and the Ottoman state's already tenuous revenue streams collapsed. By 1875, the empire faced an unprecedented dilemma. Its obligations to European creditors were fixed, while its tax base had evaporated. The treasury was empty, and a massive bond payment to London and Paris was due in October. Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha realized that the empire could not honor its commitments. New loans were impossible because the financial markets were closed. No money would arrive from abroad. Domestically, the populace could not generate enough revenue. The empire's leaders were confronted with a stark choice: continue to pay creditors and risk famine among their own people, or default and face international outrage. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree that shook the foundations of European finance. Known as the Decree of Ramadan, it declared that the empire would pay only half of its debt obligations in cash, with the remainder converted into paper bonds offering minimal interest. In the language of diplomacy, this was a moratorium. In the language of finance, it was a default. The empire had formally gone bankrupt. European investors reacted with fury. Middle-class bondholders in Britain and France saw their savings vanish overnight. Newspapers denounced the Ottomans as swindlers and thieves. Diplomatic goodwill evaporated, leaving the empire politically isolated. This financial collapse had immediate consequences beyond monetary loss. European powers, once allies against Russia, were now less inclined to offer support. The empire's weakened position emboldened external aggressors. Russia, which had long coveted Ottoman territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus, saw an opportunity to exploit the empire's vulnerability. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78 became a disaster for the Ottomans. The army, underfunded, demoralized, and often unpaid, fought bravely but could not match the organized and well-supplied Russian forces. Russian troops advanced to the outskirts of Istanbul, seeing the city's landmarks across the Golden Horn. The subsequent Treaty of San Stefano and the Congress of Berlin imposed humiliating territorial and financial settlements. Vast regions in the Balkans and the Caucasus were ceded to Russia or given autonomy. Even more consequential was the war indemnity imposed on the Ottomans. Over 800 million francs, an amount impossible for the empire to pay without further borrowing. The empire's debts now included massive obligations to foreign bankers and a punitive settlement to Russia. The total burden exceeded the Ottoman state's entire economic output. Insolvency had become total. Into this vacuum of power stepped a new form of domination. Britain and France, while no longer seeking outright territorial conquest, realized they could control the Ottoman Empire through finance. It was a strategy that required no armies, no garrisons, no colonies. Control could be achieved simply by managing the flow of money. In 1881, European representatives of the empire's creditors arrived in Istanbul. They carried briefcases, not swords, and sat across from Ottoman officials to negotiate terms of surrender. This negotiation resulted in the Decree of Muharrem, creating the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. The OPDA was a novel institution. It was not part of the Ottoman government, but a corporate entity controlled by the European banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. It assumed authority over the empire's most valuable sources of revenue. Taxes on commodities such as tobacco, salt, silk, spirits, and fishing were now collected by OPDA officials, not Ottoman bureaucrats. These men, numbering over 5,000, wore uniforms, carried arms, and answered directly to the board of directors in Europe. The empire had effectively lost its financial sovereignty. The OPDA's methods were efficient by European standards. It improved infrastructure, modernized mines, and distributed disease-free silkworms to farmers. But these improvements were designed to benefit creditors, not citizens. Revenue flowed from Ottoman lands to European pockets. By the turn of the century, roughly one-third of the empire's total revenue was siphoned off to service debt. The Ottoman state was left with scraps to fund armies, courts, and administration. Modernization within the empire stalled. Education, industrialization, and infrastructure suffered. The Sultan remained a ceremonial figurehead, while real power resided with foreign financiers. Debt, however, was not the only tool of subjugation. It also became a mechanism for foreign influence. Britain and France used financial leverage to shape Ottoman foreign policy. The empire's independence was compromised. Germany, observing the weakness created by the OPDA, pursued its own interests. Kaiser Wilhelm II cultivated relations with Istanbul, presenting Germany as a friend opposed to British and French exploitation. German bankers and engineers soon financed major infrastructure projects, most notably the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, cementing Germany's economic influence in the Middle East. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a web of foreign economic dependencies. The Young Turks, who assumed leadership in 1908, recognized that the empire was trapped. Its finances were controlled externally. Its sovereignty was compromised. When World War I broke out in 1914, the empire joined Germany in a gamble to regain independence from foreign creditors. The Ottoman government immediately halted payments to London and Paris and expelled OPDA officials, momentarily reclaiming financial autonomy. But the decision came at a cost. The war ended in catastrophe. The empire was destroyed, but the debts remained. When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk established the Turkish Republic in 1923, the new state was compelled to honor Ottoman debts, restructuring payments, but ultimately committing decades of revenue to foreign creditors. The final installment was paid in 1954, exactly a century after the first loan. The Ottoman experience offers a profound lesson. Economic dependence can be as deadly as military defeat. Empires may survive armies, sieges, and internal revolts, but they cannot endure financial subjugation. The Ottoman sultans sought to appear modern, strong, and prestigious, yet their pursuit of borrowed power led to the loss of both sovereignty and territory. This history illustrates that loans, bonds, and interest are not neutral tools. They are instruments of power that can dictate the fate of nations. Debt, once incurred, can transform an empire from a ruler of land and people into a servant of creditors. The creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, marked a turning point in the empire's history. What had begun as occasional borrowing to fund wars had evolved into a permanent structure that dictated the state's very survival. The OPDA was more than a financial institution. It was a parallel government, operating within Ottoman territory, but reporting directly to European creditors. Its existence exemplified a concept rarely discussed in contemporary history. Sovereignty is not only political or military, it is also financial. When control over revenue is ceded to foreign powers, the state loses its ability to govern freely. The OPDA implemented modern accounting practices with ruthless efficiency. Unlike the Ottoman bureaucrats, who often diverted revenue for personal gain, OPDA officials ensured that every coin collected reached its intended destination: the banks of London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. They built warehouses to store commodities such as salt and tobacco, reorganized collection systems, and even improved production processes in industries that generated export revenue. Farmers received disease-free silkworm eggs, mines were mechanized, and logistical systems were modernized. Yet these improvements served a singular purpose: the interests of European creditors, not the prosperity of Ottoman citizens. The impact on ordinary people was profound. A Greek fisherman on the Bosphorus, after a long day on the water, found that a portion of his earnings went not to his family or local administration, but directly to bondholders in London. A farmer cultivating silk cocoons in Bursa discovered that a significant portion of his income was automatically siphoned to Paris. Even the price of salt and the documentation of legal transactions were now under the control of foreign bankers. The OPDA operated as a state within a state, with its authority effectively overriding the Sultan in matters of finance. By the late 19th century, roughly one-third of the empire's revenue flowed directly to service its debts. For the Ottoman government, this left only a fraction of its income to fund the military, maintain administration, and support the court. The consequences were predictable. Armies were underpaid, creating conditions for mutiny and desertion. Infrastructure crumbled due to lack of funding, and public services stagnated. Education and industrial investment, crucial for modernization, were neglected. The empire was trapped in a cycle of underdevelopment, with its surplus wealth extracted by foreign creditors before it could be reinvested in productive enterprises. This financial subjugation did more than impoverish the state. It reshaped Ottoman politics and international relations. Sultans became ceremonial rulers. Their ability to enact meaningful economic policy was curtailed by debt obligations. Any attempt to modernize or implement reforms required approval, directly or indirectly, from the OPDA. The Sultan's palace, once a symbol of imperial authority, now housed a ruler whose hands were tied by foreign financial interests. The Sultan could propose a new school, a road, or an industrial project, but funding depended on whether the OPDA allowed it. In effect, the empire was no longer master of its own future. Meanwhile, European powers watched closely. Britain and France, whose banks controlled the OPDA, were satisfied with this arrangement. Direct territorial conquest would have been costly and politically complicated. Instead, financial control offered a cleaner and more profitable alternative. By extracting revenue through the OPDA, they could benefit indefinitely without occupying Ottoman lands or engaging in warfare. Control over finances became a form of soft imperialism, a method of domination that avoided the visible costs of military campaigns while achieving the same objectives: influence, extraction, and leverage. Germany, however, saw an opportunity to expand its own influence in the region. Unlike Britain and France, which were content to reap profits from Ottoman indebtedness, Germany pursued a strategy that combined economic, military, and political ambitions. Kaiser Wilhelm II cultivated a relationship with the Sultan, presenting Germany as a modernizing partner opposed to the exploitative practices of the British and French. The Germans offered to fund infrastructure projects, supply engineers and officers, and integrate the Ottoman economy with German strategic interests. The most significant of these projects was the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, a massive endeavor that would connect Europe directly to the Persian Gulf, bypassing British-controlled maritime routes such as the Suez Canal. For the Ottoman leadership, the railway represented a lifeline. The empire's treasury was empty, but Germany promised to finance the construction. Loans, contracts, and guarantees were extended, and soon German engineers and companies were embedded within Ottoman territory. Yet these loans were far from altruistic. The railway contracts guaranteed fixed profits for German companies, regardless of operational performance. They also included rights to natural resources along the route, including oil, minerals, and other commodities. What the Sultan perceived as a path to modernization was, in fact, another layer of foreign control. The German loans replaced the British golden handcuffs with the steel chains of economic subordination. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire had become heavily dependent on foreign powers. Its public finances were controlled externally, its revenues partially siphoned to service loans, and its infrastructure increasingly shaped by foreign interests. Germany controlled railways and strategic resources, while the OPDA, dominated by Britain, France, and other European banks, controlled essential taxation. The empire's sovereignty was compromised both economically and politically. Each foreign loan, each infrastructure project funded externally, and each bond issued reinforced the empire's dependence. The sick man of Europe was not only financially ill, it was politically constrained and strategically exposed. Internally, the consequences of this dependence were apparent. The Young Turk movement, which emerged in 1908, understood the empire's precarious position. Reform-minded officials recognized that as long as external creditors controlled Ottoman finances, the empire could not act freely. Domestic policy, military planning, and strategic decision-making were subject to external influence. The Sultan remained nominally in charge, but real authority was fragmented. Ottoman leaders were forced to operate within the constraints imposed by creditors, shaping policy to meet financial obligations rather than national interests. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 provided the empire with both a temptation and a danger. The Ottomans calculated that aligning with Germany could allow them to break free from British and French financial control. If Germany emerged victorious, Ottoman debts to Britain and France could be cancelled, and the OPDA potentially abolished. It was a gamble of existential magnitude, involving the empire's independence, territorial integrity, and financial survival. On the day the empire declared war, Ottoman officials moved decisively to expel British and French OPDA directors and halt payments to London and Paris. For a brief moment, the empire reclaimed autonomy. The exhilaration was short-lived. World War I was catastrophic for the Ottoman Empire. Military defeats, widespread famine, and internal dissent ravaged the population. The empire lost territories, and its infrastructure collapsed. Though debt payments were temporarily suspended, the empire's financial obligations remained unresolved. With the conclusion of the war and the empire's effective dissolution, the European creditors resurfaced to reclaim what they considered rightfully theirs. The subsequent Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 formalized the financial obligations of the new Turkish Republic. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey, faced the challenge of establishing a sovereign state while assuming the debts of a bankrupt empire. Ataturk's decision reflected pragmatic understanding of global economic realities. Refusing to acknowledge the debts risked isolating Turkey from the international financial system and damaging its economic credibility. By negotiating restructured payments, the new republic began a process of financial responsibility that would last decades. The Ottoman debt, originating from loans in the 1850s, would not be fully extinguished until 1954. 100 years of repayment illustrated the long-term consequences of reckless borrowing and the enduring power of creditor nations to influence the affairs of weaker states. The story of Ottoman indebtedness provides timeless lessons in economic sovereignty. The empire sought modernity, influence, and prestige, yet relied on borrowed wealth to project these ideals. Loans, bonds, and financial instruments appeared neutral, but carried inherent obligations that constrained decision-making and eroded independence. The empire's collapse was not only the result of military defeat or administrative inefficiency. It was the outcome of a financial system that allowed foreign powers to dictate the terms of survival. The Ottoman Empire's experience demonstrates that economic dependence can be as debilitating as political subjugation, and that debt, when mismanaged, becomes a tool of imperialism. The narrative of the Ottoman Empire is a cautionary tale for contemporary states as well. Nations that rely excessively on foreign borrowing without establishing productive capacity risk surrendering control over their destinies. Debt is not merely an accounting matter. It is a strategic instrument. In the Ottoman case, every bond issued, every interest payment made, reinforced the empire's subordination to foreign creditors. Sovereignty, in a modern sense, encompasses both political authority and control over finances. Losing one often undermines the other. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire's fate had been written in ledgers long before soldiers crossed borders. Debt had become the silent invader, gradually consuming resources, undermining authority, and reshaping the empire's strategic choices. European powers demonstrated that conquest need not be achieved through armies alone. Creditors, armed with interest rates and bond contracts, could achieve control as complete and as lasting as any territorial occupation. The empire's decline was, in essence, a story of numbers and agreements rather than cannons and cavalry. The Ottoman case also illustrates the interplay between debt and geopolitical maneuvering. While Britain and France prioritized profit and influence, Germany recognized strategic opportunity. Infrastructure projects such as railways were not mere economic ventures. They were instruments of influence, providing Germany with direct access to resources, transport routes, and military mobility. In this environment, debt, infrastructure, and politics were inseparable. The empire's leadership, seeking to regain autonomy and modernize, inadvertently deepened dependence by accepting foreign capital under terms that favored external powers. This pattern extended to the empire's internal administration. With the OPDA controlling taxation and revenue, Ottoman officials were relegated to the role of implementers rather than decision-makers. Economic policies, military budgeting, and public works became contingent upon the approval of foreign administrators. The empire retained nominal control, but its fiscal and strategic autonomy was severely limited. National initiatives were constrained, reform efforts were curtailed, and the state's ability to respond independently to crises was compromised. The consequences were evident in every aspect of Ottoman life. Military readiness declined because funding was insufficient and unpredictable. Public services lagged behind those of European nations. Modernization efforts were inconsistent, leaving the empire technologically and economically behind its neighbors. Social dissatisfaction grew as citizens saw wealth extracted from their lands and labor to service foreign debt. Political unrest simmered, contributing to revolts and challenges to central authority. By the outbreak of World War I, the empire was financially, politically, and militarily weakened, its fate largely sealed by the cumulative effects of decades of borrowing and external control. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire faced a perilous choice. Its finances were dominated by the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, its sovereignty curtailed by foreign control, and its economy dependent on loans and foreign capital. The leadership, guided by the Young Turks, recognized a rare opportunity. By allying with Germany, they might circumvent British and French financial domination. In essence, the Ottomans gambled on a single hand, betting the empire's survival on a German victory. The strategy was audacious, but the risks were monumental. Aligning with Germany meant that if the Central Powers were defeated, the empire would not only face military devastation, but also inherit renewed financial and territorial subjugation. Almost immediately, the Ottoman government acted to assert control. British and French OPDA officials were expelled from Istanbul. Debt payments to London and Paris were suspended. The empire temporarily reclaimed fiscal autonomy, and there was a brief euphoria among Ottoman leaders. For a moment, it seemed as though the centuries-long struggle against foreign financial domination might end. Yet the empire was ill-prepared for the realities of modern warfare. Its military, while vast on paper, suffered from years of underfunding, lack of modernization, and low morale. Armies were often inadequately supplied, poorly trained and dependent on outdated equipment. The illusions of power built by borrowed money now collided with the stark realities of war. The Ottoman war effort was marred by repeated defeats, strategic miscalculations, and logistical challenges. Campaigns on multiple fronts, including the Caucasus, the Dardanelles, Mesopotamia, and Palestine, stretched the empire thin. Troops often lacked basic provisions, medical care, and adequate ammunition. The logistical network was unreliable, with supply lines vulnerable to disruption. German officers, embedded within Ottoman units, attempted to provide strategic guidance, but their influence could not overcome systemic weaknesses. Millions of soldiers and civilians suffered the consequences, and the empire's social fabric was strained to the breaking point. Famine and disease compounded the military and economic crisis. Food shortages became widespread as agricultural production continued to decline, disrupted by conscription, transportation challenges, and natural disasters. The population endured starvation, malnutrition, and epidemics, particularly in rural Anatolia and the Balkans. Mortality rates soared, further destabilizing the empire and weakening its tax base. The very citizens whose labor had supported Ottoman revenue were now unable to contribute, creating a vicious cycle. Declining revenue led to increased debt dependence, which in turn exacerbated social and economic distress. Despite these challenges, the empire continued to finance its war through external loans, primarily from Germany, whose financial institutions were increasingly dominant. German bankers provided credit for military purchases, infrastructure, and industrial projects. However, these loans carried terms that were as predatory as previous British and French agreements. Contracts included guaranteed profits for German firms, resource concessions, and long-term repayment obligations. Ottoman debt was now a multinational web, intertwining Europe's financial interests with the empire's survival. The sultans and the Young Turk leadership were acutely aware that the empire's future hinged not only on military outcomes, but also on their ability to manage these complex financial obligations. As the war progressed, the empire's situation deteriorated further. The Central Powers eventually faced mounting pressures on multiple fronts, and Ottoman territories were systematically invaded or occupied. Allied forces seized control of key regions, including parts of the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Dardanelles. The empire's military defeats accelerated internal dislocation, as refugees fled occupied areas and conscription drew labor from essential agricultural production. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was on the brink of total collapse. Its governance structures were overstretched, revenues were depleted, and its population was exhausted by years of continuous conflict and deprivation. With the signing of the Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918, Ottoman military resistance effectively ended. Allied forces occupied key territories, including Istanbul, and European powers regained influence over the empire's finances. The war had destroyed much of the Ottoman military and civil infrastructure, and the empire's ability to operate as a sovereign state was severely compromised. Yet the most insidious element of the empire's decline, its financial obligations, remained. Debt had survived where armies had faltered. Loans, bonds, and interest agreements persisted as instruments of control. The empire's creditors demanded repayment, leveraging their financial power to influence post-war settlements. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, formally dismembered the Ottoman Empire. Vast territories were assigned to Allied powers or mandated under the League of Nations, including the Arab provinces, parts of Anatolia, and islands in the eastern Mediterranean. The treaty's financial clauses reinforced the empire's subjugation. Remaining Ottoman debt obligations were to be honored, often under terms dictated by creditors rather than the state itself. In practice, Sèvres would have left the empire both territorially and financially impotent, but the rise of the Turkish nationalist movement altered the course of history. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk emerged as the central figure in the struggle to preserve Turkish sovereignty. Leading the nationalist movement, he rejected the terms of Sèvres, fought the War of Independence, and established the Republic of Turkey in 1923. Ataturk's leadership was characterized by pragmatism and strategic vision. While determined to achieve national independence, he also recognized the necessity of participating in the global financial system. Refusal to acknowledge Ottoman debt obligations risked diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, and the potential collapse of international trade relations. In negotiating the Treaty of Lausanne, Ataturk agreed to assume responsibility for a portion of the Ottoman debt, restructuring payments over time to reduce the immediate fiscal burden on the nascent republic. The financial settlement with European powers was a careful balancing act. Ataturk sought to protect Turkey's sovereignty and economic recovery, while maintaining credibility in international financial markets. The restructuring allowed the Republic to allocate resources toward reconstruction, modernization, and the development of infrastructure critical to national independence. Yet the decision also underscored the long shadow cast by Ottoman borrowing. A century-old debt continued to shape the economic choices of a new nation. The first payment was made in installments, with Turkey committing to decades of service, illustrating the enduring consequences of financial dependence. Between 1923 and 1954, Turkey gradually repaid its Ottoman debt. The payments were extended over 30 years, reflecting both the scale of the obligations and the limited resources of a country recovering from war and revolution. By May 25, 1954, the final installment was made, closing a financial chapter that had begun with the Crimean War over a century earlier. The repayment timeline underscores a crucial historical insight. Debt can outlive empires, transcend political regimes, and continue to influence national policies long after the original borrowers have disappeared. Ottoman loans did not simply finance wars or palaces. They reshaped the trajectory of a nation for generations. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is instructive for modern observers, especially in an era where global finance intersects with national sovereignty. The empire's leaders believed they could borrow their way to modernity, using foreign credit to create the appearance of strength and prestige. Yet, the very act of borrowing placed constraints on decision-making, redirected resources away from productive uses, and ultimately facilitated foreign control. Money, far from being neutral, became an instrument of influence and coercion. Compound interest, predatory loan terms, and the administrative authority of foreign bankers achieved what military invasions could not. The subjugation of a major empire without a single battalion crossing its heartland in sustained conquest. The Ottoman experience reveals the mechanisms by which financial instruments can serve as tools of empire. The OPDA exemplified soft imperialism, an institution that collected taxes, managed resources, and controlled budgets under the guise of legality and efficiency. While it brought some modernization to the empire, these benefits were incidental, secondary to the extraction of wealth for European creditors. Debt, contracts, and loans replaced the sword as instruments of control. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Ottoman state could neither finance modernization independently nor assert sovereign control over its revenues. This created a paradox. The empire possessed the territory, culture, and history of a superpower, but lacked the fundamental economic autonomy to operate as one. Even as the empire formally ceased to exist after World War I, its financial legacy endured. The Turkish Republic inherited obligations that had been incurred decades earlier, illustrating a historical continuity of debt. This continuity emphasizes a key principle. Financial dependence can transcend political and military upheaval. In some cases, it outlasts entire regimes, influencing policy and constraining choices long after the original actors have vanished. The Ottoman example demonstrates how loans, bonds, and financial institutions can achieve strategic control that armies, treaties, and diplomacy alone may struggle to secure. The narrative also challenges conventional notions of conquest. While historians often focus on battles, treaties, and territorial annexations, the Ottoman experience highlights the power of economic mechanisms to achieve lasting domination. Empires can be weakened, subordinated, and even effectively conquered without a single battlefield engagement if creditors control key financial levers. The empire's eventual collapse into bankruptcy, territorial loss, and subservience to external interests was driven less by cannon fire than by compound interest, loans, and administrative oversight imposed from abroad. Ultimately, the Ottoman debt trap serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of finance, sovereignty, and power. Leaders who pursue prestige, modernization, or military strength through excessive borrowing risk trading autonomy for temporary advantages. Debt is never neutral. It carries obligations, conditions, and vulnerabilities. The empire's story demonstrates that the most effective conquest may not occur with armies and guns, but through the careful application of financial instruments, the slow accumulation of obligations, and the eventual extraction of sovereignty through economic means. It is a lesson as relevant today as it was in the 19th century, reminding nations that control over debt is inseparable from control over destiny. The Republic of Turkey, born from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, inherited more than territory. It inherited a century-long financial burden. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, while focused on building a modern, sovereign nation, had to confront the reality that the debts incurred by sultans over 100 years earlier were still enforceable. Rejecting these obligations risked isolation from the global financial system, blocking trade and foreign investment. The Ottoman Empire's loans had not disappeared. They had been formalized, claimed by European powers, and remained a binding legacy. Ataturk negotiated the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, restructuring the debt to make it manageable while restoring Turkey's sovereignty. Though the payments were reduced and deadlines extended, the principle of repayment remained. Every installment, beginning in the mid-1920s, symbolized both a financial obligation and Turkey's entry into the global economic system. Citizens bore the cost invisibly, as taxes were directed toward creditors rather than schools, roads, or hospitals. Yet, Turkey managed the payments with discipline, balancing the need for domestic recovery with international credibility. By May 25, 1954, Turkey made the final payment, closing a century-long chapter of debt. The Ottoman Sultan's extravagant borrowing, used to fund palaces, railways, and military projects, had finally been resolved. The payments were a reminder that loans carry enduring obligations, transcending wars, revolutions, and empires. Debt, once incurred, outlasts governments, shaping economic and political choices for generations. The Ottoman Debt Trap is a cautionary tale about financial dependency and sovereignty. Sultans sought prestige, modernization, and military strength through foreign loans, believing credit could buy power. In reality, every loan created obligations, ceded control to foreign powers, and constrained decision-making. Institutions like the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, exemplified soft imperialism, efficiently collecting taxes, managing resources, and enforcing repayment, all for the benefit of foreign creditors rather than the empire's citizens. Debt became a tool of control, more enduring than armies or treaties. World War I further exposed the empire's vulnerability. Military defeats, famine, and economic collapse underscored that borrowed wealth cannot substitute for structural strength. When the Ottoman Empire aligned with Germany, expelled British and French creditors, and attempted to regain autonomy, the gamble failed. Territory was lost, the population suffered, and financial obligations persisted. Debt outlived the empire, shaping Turkey's early policies and limiting domestic investment. The story demonstrates that modern conquest does not always require armies. Compound interest, predatory loans, and administrative oversight achieved what military invasion could not: the erosion of sovereignty. The empire's collapse illustrates a timeless lesson. Control over finances is inseparable from control over destiny. Prestige projects, military expansion, and modernization funded through external credit can instead magnify vulnerability. Every borrowed lira was a chain. Every bond was a tether. For contemporary viewers, the Ottoman debt saga is a warning. Nations must weigh borrowing against long-term consequences. Debt is never neutral. It carries obligations, conditions, and potential loss of autonomy. The Ottoman Empire's leaders underestimated the risks, trading temporary relief and prestige for long-term dependence. The Turkish Republic, under Ataturk, honored these debts, demonstrating fiscal responsibility and securing Turkey's position in the global economy. Yet the shadow of past borrowing endured, influencing policy and limiting choices for decades. The Ottoman Empire did not die solely from military defeat or territorial loss. Its decline was also the result of financial entanglement, unsustainable borrowing, and foreign control of revenue. History shows that the most effective conquest is often silent. It comes not from armies, cannons, or battles, but from compound interest, predatory loans, and the slow extraction of wealth. The sultans sought grandeur, modernity, and military might, yet the empire fell under the weight of its own debts. The ultimate lesson is clear. If you do not control your debt will control you. Sovereignty is not just flags or borders. It is the ability to make decisions free from external financial constraints. The Ottoman Empire serves as a timeless reminder that money, carefully wielded, can conquer nations more efficiently than armies. And for Turkey, the century-long journey from the Sultan's lavish borrowing to the Republic's final repayment is a story of endurance, strategy, and the enduring power of fiscal responsibility. As you reflect on this saga, remember, empires can fall without a single shot fired. Sometimes, all it takes is patience, credit, and the compounding weight of debt. The Ottoman Empire didn't die of old age. It was foreclosed upon. and its story leaves a powerful lesson for all nations navigating the delicate balance between ambition and financial sovereignty. If you found this documentary insightful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more untold historical stories. Share this video with others who appreciate real history, and let us know in the comments what story you want us to cover next. We'd also love to hear your thoughts and discussion about this story.